everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me once again is Blois Olson. He's a political analyst and publisher of Morning Take. Blois, thank you so much for joining me.
Happy to be here, Brittany.
Blois, you joined me last week for a conversation, and where we were sitting then is certainly a different time for your city and your state than we're sitting at now. Because last week you joined me to talk about Governor Tim Walz dropping his re-election bid. This comes amid the billion-dollar fraud scandal that's embroiling Minnesota's government. And just a few hours after we ended our conversation, news broke that an ICE agent fatally shot a woman in Minneapolis. The shooting of Renee Good sparked anti-ICE protests all throughout Minneapolis, and tensions on the ground in the city really seem to be at a boiling point. It's been described in headlines as a war zone and a military occupation, and the country has been seeing really stunning video of both ICE encounters as well as these protests. You're in Minnesota now, so to start off the conversation, what exactly are you seeing on the ground?
Thanks. I think it is important to just kind of set the scene, is to say that, look, this is a major metropolitan area. It's a state of 6 million people. This is not just happening in the metro area, but it's also only in pockets of our community. For instance, I live 9 minutes from downtown. I have not seen ICE activity in my neighborhood or my community. And I think depending on where you live and frankly how your neighbors are taking any ICE activity is going to determine the tension, the stress, and how it's going to impact your daily life.
President Trump obviously has waded into this conversation, as have many other leaders. But just yesterday, President Trump threatened to invoke the Insurrection Act that would give him the authority to deploy federal troops to the city. How is that being received?
It just depends on who you talk to. But I think it's a shock to anyone who's, a centrist or trying to find a resolution to this situation. Let's just start with the level of escalation in the last 9 days. ICE had already escalated its presence here, and that had people on edge. And you mentioned a lot of the videos we've seen about ICE encounters. We've heard story after story of random individuals being stopped on the sidewalk. And then when Renee Good was killed, it became clear that tension would be here. Of course, we had George Floyd riots as the epicenter of the George Floyd Black Lives Matters protests of 2020. So Minneapolis is on edge during these moments anyways. And so what I would say is that President Trump's suggestion that he would enact the Insurrection Act was just kind of the next level of escalation. And what I'll tell you here is that the business community, some leaders, the mayor are really working to de-escalate with Washington, are really trying to find a path that the state could work with the federal government to make sure that there was a coordinated effort on any fugitive immigrants that the federal government is seeking. I think one of the pieces that is somewhat mind-boggling is that it was about 8 weeks ago that Secretary Noem came to town and said that they were going to increase their activity here. But it appears as that nobody from the Walz administration or the cities reached out and said, is there a way to work together here? The immediate reaction was the politics of the day. And obviously Democrats, and especially in Minnesota, liberal Democrats base, does not want to do anything with ICE, does not want to do anything with the White House. And so since then, it's just been escalation after escalation after escalation. And I think that's where you begin to kind of see what the tension here is. The mood of the state is just anxious and really wants, a normalization back as soon as we can.
You brought up that unrest, those massive protests in the weeks following the killing of George Floyd back in 2020. Is this time similar? Are people remembering that time, and does it feel similar in the city, A? And B, has the city learned any lessons since then that they're applying now?
First off, this isn't close to the level of protest today. This is very small relative to the George Floyd killing. I think you have to look at the factors in both situations. I'd also say that there's a reflex that we've learned in Minnesota between George Floyd and the killing of Dante Wright, that multiple ways in which we've been better prepared. City officials have been better prepared. The state government's been better prepared and more fast acting. I think the delay in being prepared for the Floyd protests, which turned violent, turned destructive, taught a lesson. So, for instance, last week, immediately the National Guard was put on alert. They have not been called out here. And yet, state police did come out last Thursday and Friday night. They did calm things. But just to put it in perspective, there was a massive rally last Saturday of about 10,000 people. Very, very peaceful, and ended before nightfall. And so we've had some protests at night, some vandalism, but relative to 2020, it's minuscule.
In the direct aftermath of the shooting of Renee Good, the Minneapolis mayor told ICE, "Get the F out of our city." Just this week, President Trump threatened to invoke the Insurrection Act. So I'm curious what you make of the responses and the reactions of local, state, and federal leaders here. How do you think they're handling this? I'm thinking of Democrats like Mayor Fry, as well as Governor Tim Walz, as well as Republicans like Congressman Tom Emmer and President Donald Trump. Because you've recently wrote in a piece that you think that these leaders should try something different because what they're doing isn't working. You also say this isn't a moment for politics, it's a moment for diplomacy. So what do you think these leaders need to be doing differently?
You know, I fundamentally believe actually it's the loudest voices that you see that are not going to solve the problem. I think there's quiet voices on both sides of the aisle, Republicans and Democrats, that are working behind the scenes. The business community has leaned in, CEOs. You know, Minnesota is the home of more Fortune 500 companies per capita than any other, region. And so large employers, CEOs are leaning in. The business community is saying this is impacting our economy. This is impacting our restaurants, our quality of life. We did some recent research that said, 65% of Minnesotans feel like we have the best quality of life in America. And so I think this becomes one of those quality of life issues that the sooner we can get back to normal. I think that, your viewers should know that behind the scenes, without fanfare, without stagecraft, there is an earnest effort to find an off-ramp to the tension between ICE, the city of Minneapolis, and the state of Minnesota. It's going to take diplomacy, it's going to take relationships, and it's going to take trust. And I think one of the things the country sees, and it's very similar to Congress. In Congress, you have 435 members of the House and 100 senators. Yet you hear about 15 to 20 of them more than you hear about the rest of them. In Minnesota, you hear about Governor Walz, you hear about Mayor Fry, you hear about Tom Emmer, you hear about the president's tweets or posts about Minnesota, but you don't know about, an Angie Craig, an Amy Klobuchar, a Brad Finstad, or a Mark Johnson, that are working to try to find a different approach diplomatically. They've all expressed concern. There's nothing on the table, but there certainly is, conversation happening about what would be the best way to do that.
And what do you think that off-ramp looks like? Because as of now, there are thousands of federal agents in the city. What looks like a de-escalation that works?
Brittany, I'm not at liberty to say right now, but I think what I've said before and I've said yesterday was there has to be a way for the state and the federal government to work together. I don't know the specifics of that, but as of right now, they're not working together. And until they do work together, I just don't think President Trump's going to allow that to be the case. If you look at the messaging out of the White House the last 2 days, they've tried to specify kind of what they're looking for in Minnesota. And Minnesota has pushed back and said, we don't think that exists here. There has to be kind of the middle of the Venn diagram where they can find some common ground. And frankly, I've also said that's not going to happen through news conferences or addresses to the state or tweets or press releases. It's going to happen through conversation. And so hopefully those conversations are starting in earnest and they continue.
I know you mentioned the business community a few times in this conversation. I was listening to one of your other interviews and you talked about the economic impacts a bit. You said recruiters are having a tough time selling Minnesota right now. I don't think people are looking at the videos of these protests of ICE agents in Minneapolis and exactly are chomping at the bit to go on a vacation in Minnesota or Minneapolis. Is the business community really concerned about potential long-term impacts here?
Yeah, the region's reputation is at stake again. And, I think the region's reputation started to make an earnest comeback over the last few years after George Floyd. And, I think that we joke that Minnesota's hard enough to sell with the weather, the tax environment. But once you get here, you don't want to leave because we have 4 seasons. You have a great quality of life. People love our public schools. They love our outdoor activities. We have one of the greatest healthcare systems in America. And so I think that is what has attracted people here. But, if you were up for an interview and you were going to move here and you saw the coverage or the footage, you might think, no, that's not the case. We always joke that, we'll have you in January and we'll see how much you love it if you've been here in June or July. And, the reality is it's cold here right now. That's also, I think, helped keep things calmer, is because, it's supposed to get to -4 this weekend. And so hopefully that keeps a lot of people inside safe, away from frostbite, and also just kind of keeps protesters from, ramping up after a second shooting this past week.
And you all have that reputation of being Minnesota nice. And I know as someone who's born and bred on the East Coast, I mean, that's a really nice reputation to have. We certainly don't have that. But when you're looking at polling here of how Americans are viewing what happened in Minneapolis, 51% of Americans think that ICE is making our cities less safe. And most Americans think that the officer who shot Renee Good was unjustified. When you're looking at the political landscape here, we have midterms at the end of the year. Minnesota's having a governor's race. What type of impact is this having on the political landscape?
Early on, I would say that this is going to hurt Republicans in the state. It's a midterm. It's going to be tough for them. In 2022, Republicans lost both bodies, the House, the Senate, and the governor's office. Democrats had a trifecta, as they called it, and they moved very progressive legislation. I believe that if they were to get another trifecta, it would be even more activist driven from potentially the far left. The loudest voices from the left would drive the agenda in St. Paul during that legislative session. And I think state Republicans know that. I think they're concerned about that. With the fraud issue, the last reason we talked, there was a sense that Republicans and Minnesota could use some fiscal discipline and checks and balances around spending. But emotions and rights are going to start to take over. I'm working on a piece right now as a little preview that, rights and ICE are the Dobbs of 2026. Because if you remember back to 2022, the Supreme Court threw out Roe versus Wade with the Dobbs decision. That energized Democrats in a big way. And I believe that the ICE presence in Minnesota is going to energize Democrats and independents to push back against Trump and Republicans.
Even before the shooting of Renee Good, the acting ICE director said that the largest immigration operation ever was underway in Minneapolis. And this was seen in a large part because of the fraud scandal that has really embroiled your state. Is Governor Walz getting any blowback for this? Is he getting blamed for this, that ICE is even in the state to begin with because of that fraud scandal?
It's a very divided state and has been for a number of years. The challenge is Democrats have held all statewide offices. Republicans have not won statewide here in 20 years. And so I really want to kind of segment out your question a little. Fraud is an issue. It's continuing to be an issue. And the federal government is looking at immigration issues. The federal government is looking at fraud issues. Governor Walz frames it as a full-on attack on Minnesota from the federal government. But I think most independents were siding with the federal government when it came to investigating fraud. I think it's which issue overtakes the other issue. Does the ICE presence make independents think, look, our rights are being violated. I can't vote for that. And if fraud has to take a back seat, then it has to take a back seat. We have a solid 11 months, a little less than 11 months till the election. So I think we have a lot of time to work those things out. But I want to be frank that that's under consideration here. And I think as Republicans wanted to run on fraud, they wanted the federal government's help to deal with fraud. They would have taken 1,000 auditors and 1,000 inspectors before they would have taken another 1,000 or 2,000 ICE agents.
Does it seem like then, or is there this perception that fraud is on the back burner now? Because the federal prosecutor who was investigating this fraud, he resigned this week, and he reportedly resigned because of the DOJ's push to investigate Renee Good's widow. And at the time of his investigation into the fraud, he said he saw industrial scale fraud. He suggested at least $9 billion could have been fraudulent. He said that this fraud scandal was swamping Minnesota and calling into question everything we know about our state. I mean, that was just a really big charge. The fact that he's now resigned, paired with now what we're seeing with ICE, is there this sense that the fraud investigation's now taken a backseat?
No, I think it certainly has in the headlines and in the news. Attorney General Ellison did charge somebody this week with $3 million fraud on Medicaid. So they're still doing the work on fraud. But yeah, absolutely. I think there's going to be at least a slowdown in prosecutions from the federal government because of Joe Thompson leaving the U.S. Attorney's Office. Having said that, people leave the U.S. Attorney's office often because of either disagreement or a change in administration. And so my sense would be that it would be the Department of Justice's goal to spread that work to other places to continue to investigate fraud. I don't think the investigation of fraud is going to go away from the federal government. I think it might just be slowed for a short time before they dig back in.
I said this to you before our conversation began, but I'm not from New York. I'm from Pennsylvania, a smaller town in the suburbs of Philadelphia. And I would always get frustrated when there was a national news story regarding Philadelphia or perhaps something in rural Pennsylvania, and the national media would swoop in, oftentimes either DC or New York. They would cover it, and I would think, hey, you know what? You're getting X, Y, or Z wrong. Is that how you're feeling right now? Are you looking at the national coverage of this? Are you thinking anything's getting mistaken, warped, taken out of context? How do you think the national headlines are doing right now?
Brittany, we're both in media, we're both in news, and we follow it very closely. I think that, news covers the news. What's breaking? What's different? If we were boring old Minnesota, there would be no coverage. And so other than us hosting a Super Bowl or World Juniors like a couple weeks ago, we just kind of go about our lives. So I think that what I would say to viewers is understand that this is a major issue here. There is major tension here. But this is a metropolitan area of 4.5 million people. And so this is not on every street corner. This is not on every block. I go into sporting events, go into the theater, go into restaurants. It's still happening in the vast majority of the city. There is some slowdown because of economic activity and staffing issues. But overall, what you see on the news is the drama of the politics of the moment, the presence of ICE, the videos, and the idea of this is an era. Like, for instance, if this was 25 years ago, you wouldn't have all these videos. You'd just have news crews trying to capture it. And I think we just get oversaturated with those videos. My daughter said to me yesterday, is this true about a certain video or a protest that was upcoming? And I was like, as far as we know. And I think that's what people need to know. I'd also say that, I believe that the de-escalation can happen quickly. I think that if there's some sort of agreement or alignment on the roles of the state and the federal government, that the ICE agents would leave quickly, that things would feel normal faster. And again, it's January. We have a couple more months before everybody wants to visit again.
Even Joe Rogan waded into this conversation. He was saying it's scary. Americans are scared seeing ICE snatch people up off the streets. He was talking about the video of Renee Good and said that from what he saw, it seemed unjustified. When you're looking at that and when you're looking at how this conversation really is everywhere, I mean, what do you make of that?
Well, I think this is the point of the conversation. We're familiar with it from George Floyd. I think one of the things is we're tired of being the center point of these national conversations. And that's exhausting. It's exhausting to talk about, it's exhausting to cover, all those things. Look, I think that when you look at the way in which ICE has behaved in Minnesota and or other states, which frankly I didn't follow as closely. I followed it, but not as closely, is that anyone in 2026 America wouldn't view that as the way in which their constitutional rights, that rights of free expression are there. On the other hand, there is a subculture, subset of activists, whether they're kind of more anarchy, more DSA, they're anti-law enforcement. And they want to harass and track and video law enforcement, which only raises the tension. Look, I'm a First Amendment absolutist. I think that everybody should be able to say what they want to say. But at some point, you have to take into mind the responsibility and the accountability is to not escalate, but just simply film. And I think there's a lot of people here that have provoked ICE unnecessarily. And I also think ICE has not had the cooler head or the calmer approach in those moments.
Blois, I really appreciate your perspective here and you making sense and describing what exactly is going on the ground in your city and your state. Blois, you're welcome back anytime. I hope you can join me again soon. Thanks for coming on.
Anytime, Britt.